The mansion's marble floors reflected the moonlight as Mr. Thompson collapsed to his knees, clutching the handwritten note to his chest. "You saved us when no one else would," it read. Sarah's final words echoed in his mind as tears streamed down his weathered face. Outside, the silhouette of a young man stood watching. The boy he'd once rescued from the streets now returned to save him from the greatest poverty of all, a life without meaning. Millionaire, C, mother with 2 children. On the street, what he did changed his life forever. Before we start this exciting story, drop in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to give your comment a little heart. Now, let's begin this emotional journey. Richard Thompson drummed his fingers against the leather steering wheel of his Bentley Continental, the soft purr of the engine barely audible as he waited for the light to change. Chicago's November wind hurled the season's first snowflakes against his windshield, each one disappearing on contact like fleeting thoughts. "Quarterly reports look promising, Richard," his financial advisor's voice crackled through the car's speaker system. "The Thompson Foundation assets increased by 12% this quarter alone." Good, Richard murmured, his attention drifting to the world outside his temperature-controlled sanctuary. 57 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A portfolio worth billions, 3 empty homes, and dinner reservations for 1. The light turned green, and Richard accelerated, turning onto Lakeside Drive, taking the scenic route home. Instead of the expressway, something about the lake calmed him, even when hidden behind winter's approaching gloom. That's when he saw them. A woman, mid-30s perhaps, her auburn hair whipping across her face in the bitter wind, stood on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped protectively around 2 children. But it wasn't just the family that caught his eye, it was their possessions. A worn sofa, stacked boxes, a small kitchen table, all piled haphazardly on the curb like discarded dreams. "Richard, are you still there?" The voice from the speaker seemed to come from another universe entirely. "I'll call you back," Richard said, pulling his car to the curb 20 yards ahead of the family. He stepped out, the cold air slapping his face, a stark contrast to the warmth of his vehicle. As he approached them, the woman pulled her children closer, wariness etched into the lines around her eyes. "Are you folks all right?" Richard asked, keeping his distance, aware of how he might appear, a stranger in a $1,000 overcoat approaching a clearly vulnerable family. "We're fine," the woman answered, her voice steady despite the slight quiver in her chin. "Just waiting for a friend to pick us up." The boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped slightly forward, his small hand still gripping his mother's coat. "We got evicted," he announced with a directness that only children possess. "But Mom says we'll be okay." "Ethan," the woman whispered, her cheeks flushing crimson against her pale skin. Richard nodded slowly, taking in the furniture getting dusted with snow, the little girl, younger than the boy, whose teeth had begun to chatter. "I'm Richard Thompson," he said simply, "and I have a car with plenty of room in the trunk. Wherever you're heading, I can help get your things there." The woman's eyes narrowed. "We don't take charity from strangers." "It's not charity," Richard replied, the wind carrying his words. "It's a neighbor helping another neighbor, that's all." The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, I'm cold," she whispered, loud enough for Richard to hear. Something shifted in the woman's expression, pride wrestling with necessity, dignity arm wrestling with the reality of 2 cold children and nowhere to go. "I'm Sarah," she finally said. "These are my children, Ethan and Emily." Richard smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes for the first time that day. "Where are you headed, Sarah?" "Evanston Community Shelter," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "My friend can't come for another hour and they close intake at 6. Richard checked his watch. 4:30 p.m. The sky was already darkening, the temperature dropping by the minute. "I can have you there in 20 minutes, he said, already walking toward the largest piece of furniture, a worn love seat with faded floral upholstery. "Let's get your things loaded up." As he reached for the first item, Sarah's hand shot out, catching his sleeve. "Why?" she asked, the single word heavy with suspicion born of hard experience. Richard paused, snow collecting on his shoulders. A dozen responses flashed through his mind, platitudes about kindness, something about holiday spirit, perhaps a vague reference to social responsibility. Instead, he found himself saying, "Because I can." For a moment, only the sound of passing. Traffic and wind filled the space between them. Then Sarah nodded once, decisively. "Ethan, help Mr. Thompson with the smaller boxes. "Emily, gather your backpack." Within minutes, Richard's immaculate trunk and back seat were filled with the modest possessions of Sarah's family. The children climbed into the back, their eyes wide as they sank into the leather seats. Sarah hesitated at the passenger door. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words barely audible above the wind. Richard nodded, feeling something unfamiliar stir within him. Not pity, but something more uncomfortable. Recognition, perhaps, of what could happen to anyone when luck turns its back. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught Ethan's earnest gaze in the rearview mirror. "Nice car, mister," the boy said. "Someday I'm going to have one just like it." Richard smiled. "I have no doubt you will." Little did he know that this chance encounter on a snowy Chicago afternoon would set in motion events that would transform not just Sarah's family, but his own carefully ordered existence in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. As the Bentley merged into traffic, snowflakes began to fall more heavily, blanketing the city in silent white, covering the spot where Sarah's possessions had stood moments before, erasing all evidence of their intersection with Richard Thompson's life. But some marks, once made, can never truly be erased. The Evanston Community Shelter loomed before them, a converted church with peeling white paint and a sign that promised "Hope lives here" in faded blue letters. Richard helped unload Sarah's possessions onto the curb, his expensive leather shoes gathering slush with each trip between car and sidewalk. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floor. The intake desk was staffed by a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who barely looked up from her paperwork. "Family of 3, she asked, sliding a form across the counter. "We're almost at capacity tonight." Sarah's hand trembled as she filled out the form. Richard noticed Ethan watching his mother, the boy's small shoulders squared with a determination that seemed far beyond his years. "Will we have our own room?" Emily whispered, her voice small in the echoing space. Sarah's pen hesitated mid-stroke. "I don't know, sweetie." The intake worker glanced up. "Families get partitioned areas, but it's still communal. One bathroom for every 20 people. Emily's face crumpled. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it reassuringly, though Richard could see the despair in her eyes. "How did you end up here?" Richard asked quietly as they waited for processing. Sarah stared straight ahead. "My husband died 3 years ago. Cancer. No insurance." Each word fell like a stone. "I've been working 2 jobs, but medical debt collectors garnished my wages. Couldn't keep up with rent increases." Ethan stood rigidly beside his mother. "Dad said I'm the man of the house now. I'm supposed to take care of them." Richard felt something twist inside his chest. Here was a child shouldering burdens no child should carry, while he worried about investment returns. "Let's get your furniture." "Inside," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't fully understand. The shelter's common room was crowded with other families, a patchwork of loss and resilience. Richard helped Sarah arrange her small kitchen table in the corner of their assigned space, separated from others only by thin partitions that didn't reach the ceiling. Emily clutched her worn teddy bear, tears silently streaming down her face as she sat on the edge of a cot. Sarah knelt before her, wiping away the tears. "It's temporary, baby, just temporary." "But my friends won't know where I am," Emily sobbed, "and I can't bring them here." Richard stood awkwardly, an intruder in this intimate moment of grief. He should leave, go back to his empty mansion, his carefully ordered life, yet his feet remained rooted to the spot. "If I make everything right, nothing can go wrong," Ethan muttered, arranging a small collection of books beside his cot. "If I do everything right, nothing can go wrong." "What's that?" Richard asked. "Something Dad used to say," the boy replied, not looking up. "If you do the right thing, nothing can go wrong. I'm going to do everything right. I'm going to give Mom and Emily a real home again." The raw determination in the child's voice struck Richard like a physical blow. How many times had he walked past people on the street, averting his eyes from their suffering? How many charitable galas had he attended, writing checks while keeping the actual recipients at a comfortable distance? "Sarah," Richard said suddenly, "I have a proposition." Sarah looked up, wariness returning to her expression. "I own several properties. One is sitting empty in Oak Park, 3 bedrooms, fully furnished." The words tumbled out before he could reconsider. "You could stay there. No rent until you get back on your feet." Sarah stood slowly, her face hardening. "We're not a charity case, Mr. Thompson." "It's not charity," Richard insisted. "The house is just sitting there, depreciating. You'd be doing me a favor by maintaining it." Sarah's laugh was bitter, Rich people and their favors. Richard glanced at Emily's tear-stained face, then at Ethan's determined stance. Think about it, here's my card. As he turned to leave, a thin hand caught his sleeve. It was Ethan. If I do everything right, nothing can go wrong, the boy repeated, his eyes intense. Will you help us do the right thing? Richard felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the carefully constructed wall between himself and the world's pain. I'll be back tomorrow, he promised. We'll figure something out. As he walked to his car, snow now falling heavily, Richard realized he'd just made a commitment to strangers that would change all their lives forever. Richard Thompson couldn't sleep that night. The image of Sarah's family in that sterile shelter haunted him. His 5,000-square-foot lakefront mansion felt obscenely empty, each room a monument to wealth that served no purpose beyond housing his solitude. At dawn, he made a decision. By 8 a.m. he was at the shelter again, keys in hand. Sarah was already awake, attempting to comb Emily's tangled hair, while the little girl winced with each stroke. Dark circles underscored Sarah's eyes, evidence of a sleepless night on the thin shelter mattress, Mr. Thompson, she said, surprise evident in her voice. I didn't expect to see you again. I meant what I said. He held out the keys. The house is yours for as long as you need it. Ethan appeared from behind a partition, his gaze fixed on the keys dangling from Richard's fingers. For real? The hope in the boy's voice made Richard's chest tighten. For real? Sarah shook her head. We can't accept... Mom. Ethan's voice cracked with unusual authority. We can't stay here. Emily cried all night. That man in the corner keeps staring at us. Richard noticed Sarah's jaw clench. She'd noticed the man too. 3 months, Richard offered. Stay 3 months, get back on your feet. No strings attached. Sarah studied him, years of hard lessons etched in the lines around her eyes. Why are you doing this? Richard couldn't articulate the answer, not fully. Let's just say I've been fortunate. It's time some of that fortune meant something. 2 hours later, Richard's Bentley pulled up to a modest craftsman-style house in Oak Park. Not his largest property, but comfortable. 3 bedrooms, a small, yard-quiet neighborhood. Emily's eyes widened as they stepped inside. It's like a real house, she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly might make it disappear. Ethan walked from room to room, suspicion and hope warring on his young face. There's no catch? No catch, Richard assured him. I own several properties. This one's been sitting empty since my mother passed. Sarah ran her fingers along the kitchen counter. Your mother lived here? Richard nodded. Until 5 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah said softly. The simple condolence hit Richard unexpectedly hard. When was the last time anyone had acknowledged his grief? His business associates had sent obligatory flower arrangements. His ex-wife had texted, sorry to hear about Eleanor. But this genuine sympathy from a woman with every reason to focus solely on her own troubles, blindsided him. Thank you, he managed, turning away to compose himself. The refrigerator is stocked. Utilities are on. There's a bus stop at the corner for the kids' school. Sarah's fingers twisted together. About schools, we've moved so many times. Their records are a mess. I have connections at the local schools, Richard offered. I can make some calls. Later, after helping move their meager belongings inside, Richard prepared to leave. In the driveway, Sarah approached him. I need you to understand something, she said, her voice low so the children couldn't hear. This arrangement, it can only be temporary. I won't be indebted to anyone, no matter how kind they seem. The implications stung, though Richard understood its origin. I respect that. 3 months, no strings. After that, we can reevaluate. Sarah nodded curtly. My husband James was a good man. He got sick so quickly, by the time they diagnosed the pancreatic cancer, it was everywhere. Her voice caught. He died believing his life insurance would protect us. What he didn't know was that the premiums had lapsed during his final hospitalization. Richard listened, understanding now the wall she'd built around herself and her children. The medical bills took everything, she continued. Our savings, our home, his. Parents blamed me, said I should have noticed the symptoms sooner. Her laugh was hollow, as if I didn't replay every moment looking for signs I missed. That's not fair, Richard said quietly. Life isn't fair, Mr. Thompson. My children learned that lesson at ages 7 and 5. Sarah squared her shoulders. So yes, we'll accept your help, but I'll find work. I'll pay you back every penny. That's not necessary. It is to me, she interrupted. Ethan is already carrying too much weight on his shoulders, believing he has to save us. I need to show him that's my job, not his. That night, alone again in his mansion, Richard found himself standing in his home office staring at the photographs on his desk. His ex-wife, his estranged daughter, Caroline, who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. His parents, long gone. He'd built an empire of wealth and a desert of relationships. His phone rang, his financial advisor again with news about a potential acquisition. Richard listened absently, his mind still on the small family settling into his mother's house. Actually, Tom, he interrupted, there's something else I need you to handle. I want to set up a blind trust. Beneficiary information to come later. 2 weeks passed. Richard checked in occasionally, always calling first, never presuming. Sarah had found work as a medical billing specialist. Ironic, given how medical bills had destroyed her life. But the hours were stable and the pay decent. The children were enrolled in school. On his 3rd visit, Richard arrived to find the house empty. A hastily scrawled note on the counter. At hospital. Emily collapsed at school. Without hesitation, Richard drove to the nearest emergency room. There he found them. Sarah, pale and terrified, and Ethan, silently clutching his sister's small backpack, his expression eerily adult. What happened? Richard asked, joining them in the waiting room. Sarah looked up, surprise momentarily displacing worry. You came. Of course I came. What's wrong with Emily? Sarah's composure finally cracked. They think it might be her heart. James had a congenital defect. The doctors always said the kid should be monitored, but without insurance. She dissolved into tears she'd clearly been holding back for Ethan's benefit. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, his mind already working through options, specialists he knew, strings he could pull. Ethan looked up at him, eyes dry but desperate. If I do everything right, nothing can go wrong, he whispered. But I don't know what the right thing is anymore. The hospital corridor seemed endless, its fluorescent lights casting everyone in a sickly pallor. Richard paced while Sarah spoke, with the doctor, watching Ethan through the window of the small waiting area. The boy sat perfectly still, Emily's backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, Sarah said when she returned, the medical term stumbling from her lips. The same thing that weakened James's heart. It's hereditary. Richard leaned against the wall, absorbing the gravity of the diagnosis. What's the treatment plan? There isn't one, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Not without insurance. They're stabilizing her, but she needs specialized care, ongoing monitoring, possibly surgery. Her hands shook violently. The social worker suggested I apply for emergency state coverage, but approval takes months. Emily doesn't have months. Without hesitation, Richard pulled out his phone. Cindy, it's Richard. I need you to call Dr. Hartman at Northwestern Memorial. Yes, the cardiologist. Tell him I have a patient who needs immediate attention. I'll cover all costs. Sarah stared at him, eyes wide. Richard, no, this isn't negotiable, he said, an unfamiliar steel in his voice. Emily needs care. I can provide it. End of discussion. Within hours, Emily was transferred to Northwestern's prestigious pediatric cardiology unit. Richard's name opened doors that Sarah's desperate pleas could not. By evening, the little girl was settled in a private room, monitors beeping steadily. As she slept, "You don't understand what you're committing to," Sarah said, standing with Richard in the hallway while Ethan sat vigilant at his sister's bedside. "These treatments can cost hundreds of thousands." "I'm worth billions," Richard replied simply. "What good is money if it can't save a child's life?" Sarah studied him, really looked at him perhaps for the first time. "Why us? You could help anyone, fund a whole hospital wing. Why my family?" Richard had asked himself the same question every night since their first encounter. "I've donated to hospitals before, written checks at galas, seen my name on plaques, but I never saw the actual people. With you, I see." 2 days later, Emily was discharged with a treatment plan, medications and appointments scheduled with the city's top specialists. Richard drove them home to Oak Park, the car unusually quiet. Inside the house, Emily went straight to bed, exhausted from her ordeal. Ethan disappeared into his room without a word. Sarah collapsed onto the living room sofa. "He blames himself," she said when Richard brought her tea. "Ethan, as if a 10-year-old could somehow prevent genetic heart disease." Richard sat beside her. "That's a heavy burden for small shoulders." After James died, Ethan found his journal. There was an entry about chest pains James had been hiding from me. Sarah's voice was hollow with old grief. Ethan convinced himself that if he'd shown me the journal sooner, his father might have lived. That's not fair to— life isn't fair, Sarah interrupted, echoing her earlier words. I've tried to tell him it wasn't his responsibility, but— She gestured helplessly. Now with Emily sick too, he's retreating further into himself. That mantra about doing everything right, it's his way of trying to control a world that's proved repeatedly it can't be controlled. Richard understood controlling behavior all too well. Hadn't his own empire been built on the illusion of mastering chaos through wealth and power? I should check on him, Sarah said, rising wearily. May I? Richard asked, surprising himself. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Richard knocked softly on Ethan's door. When no answer came, he opened it slowly. Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, his father's journal open beside him, methodically arranging baseball cards in precise rows. Your mom told me about your dad's journal, Richard said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Ethan didn't look up. If I'd shown it to Mom sooner, she could have made him go to the doctor. Ethan, Richard said gently, your father was an adult. He made his choices. Bad choices, the boy muttered. Yes, Richard agreed, earning a surprised glance from Ethan. Your father made a mistake hiding his symptoms, but that was his mistake, not yours. But if I do everything right, sometimes everything can go wrong anyway, Richard said quietly. I did everything right by society's standards, built a successful business, married the right woman, had the right house. And you know what? He waited until Ethan met his eyes. I ended up alone anyway. My wife left. My daughter won't speak to me. Ethan's brow furrowed. You have a daughter, Caroline. She's 28 now. Richard swallowed hard. I missed so much of her life chasing success that eventually she stopped waiting for me to show up. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want you to make my mistakes, Richard said. Trying to control everything, be perfect all the time. It doesn't work, Ethan. It just makes you miss what's important. Ethan's lower lip trembled. If Emily dies too, Emily has the best doctors now, Richard assured him. And unlike your dad, she's getting treatment early. That makes a huge difference. Later that night, Richard found Sarah in the kitchen, staring blankly at bills spread across the table. Medical forms, past due notices, collection letters. I should have seen signs in James, she whispered. Should have noticed when Emily got winded at the playground. Sarah. And now I've made. Gaz dependent on a stranger. Her laugh was brittle. No offense, none taken. Richard sat across from her. But I'm not just helping you out of charity. For the first time in years, I feel useful, connected. Sarah looked up, her expression unreadable. That's dangerous territory, Richard. Connections mean pain when they break. They've already broken for me, he replied. My wife left me for her yoga instructor 6 years ago. My daughter stopped answering my calls 3 years later. I'm sorry. The simple words again, genuine in their delivery. Caroline said I was never really present, even when I was physically there. Richard stared at his hands. She was right. The silence between them hung heavy with shared suffering, different wounds from the same sharp edge of life. I should go, Richard finally said, rising. You need rest. At the door, Sarah caught his sleeve. Thank you. For Emily. For talking to Ethan. I'll check in tomorrow, he promised. Driving home, Richard's phone rang, his executive assistant with an urgent matter requiring his attention. A deal in jeopardy, millions at stake. For the first time in his career, Richard found himself saying, "It can wait until morning." That night, he dug through storage boxes until he found what he was searching for, an old photograph album. Caroline's childhood, preserved in images he'd barely paused to appreciate when they were being created. Richard Thompson, billionaire, fell asleep in his chair, the album open on his lap, tears drying on his cheeks. 2 months passed. Emily's condition stabilized with medication, though her small body struggled with the side effects. Fatigue, dizziness, occasional nausea. Sarah worked double shifts to maintain a semblance of financial independence, despite Richard's assurances that money wasn't an issue. Ethan's grades improved as he threw himself into schoolwork, still clinging to his mantra of control. Richard found himself spending more evenings at the Oak Park house than his own mansion. Simple dinners at Sarah's kitchen table felt more substantial than any business dinner he'd attended in years. One evening in January, as Chicago's infamous wind howled outside, Richard arrived with groceries to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, a letter clutched in her hand, her face ashen. "What's wrong?" Richard set the bags down, immediately concerned. Sarah handed him the letter wordlessly. Official letterhead from the law firm representing her late husband's parents. "They're suing for custody," she whispered, voice hollow with disbelief. They claim I'm an unfit mother because I can't financially provide for the children or manage Emily's medical needs. Richard scanned the document, fury building in his chest. This is absurd. You're an excellent mother. They have money, Sarah said flatly. They have a stable home. They haven't been evicted or lived in shelters. And now they're using Emily's condition as proof that I'm failing them. Her laugh was bitter. The irony is they barely spoke to James after he married me. I wasn't from the right background. They visited once after he died, saw our apartment, and left without offering help. Richard set the letter down. I'll call my attorneys. No, Sarah's voice was firm. I need to handle this myself. Sarah, be reasonable. These people have resources. And now I'll appear even more dependent if some billionaire fights my battles. Her eyes flashed with a combination of fear and determination. I need to stand on my own 2 feet in court. At least let me recommend. I said no. Sarah stood abruptly. Your charity already has strings, Richard, whether you admit it or not. What happens when you get bored with your pet project family and move on? The accusation stung. Is that what you think this is? I don't know what this is, Sarah admitted, deflating slightly, but I know I can't keep accepting help without consequences. A small noise from the doorway interrupted them. Emily stood there in her pajamas, face pale and drawn from her medications. Are you fighting because of me? She asked in a small voice. No, sweetie, Sarah said quickly, composing herself. Everything's fine. Emily looked unconvinced. Grandma and Grandpa Wilson want us to live with them, don't they? They said so when they called. They called you. Sarah's voice sharpened with alarm. Emily nodded. They said you were too sick to take care of us properly, and that we'd have our own rooms at their house in Lake Forest. Sarah's hands trembled as she guided Emily back to bed. Richard remained in the kitchen, seething quietly, examining his own motivations. Was there truth in Sarah's accusation? Was he just playing savior to feel better about his empty life? When Sarah returned, her expression was closed off. I think you should go. Sarah! Please, Richard, I need space to think. Outside, snow had begun to fall, creating a deceptive blanket of peace over the city's jagged edges. Richard sat in his car, engine running, heat blasting, unable to drive away. His phone rang. Caroline's. Name flashing on the screen for the first time in years. His heart lurched as he answered. Caroline? Dad. His daughter's voice was cool, controlled. I'm in Chicago. My fiancé's exhibition opens tomorrow at the Art Institute. Mom mentioned you're still in the area. You're engaged? Richard felt a pang that he'd missed such a milestone. For 8 months now, Caroline replied. I sent an announcement to your office. Another failure so focused on business that personal mail had likely been filed away unread by his assistant. I'd love to see you, Richard said, hating the naked hope in his voice. The opening's at 7, black tie. A pause. You can bring someone if you'd like. After they disconnected, Richard sat staring at the dark windows of Sarah's house. Caroline's unexpected overture felt significant, a door cracking open to a relationship he'd thought permanently closed. Inside the house, Ethan watched from his bedroom window as Richard's car finally pulled away. The boy returned to his desk, where he'd been drafting a letter of his own, to the grandparents he barely knew, begging them not to take him and Emily away. His carefully printed words blurred as tears fell, smudging the ink. If I do everything right, nothing can go wrong, he whispered, the mantra sounding hollow even to his own ears. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office to find Marcus Johnson, his oldest friend and business partner, waiting with an unusual expression of concern. What's going on? Richard asked, setting down his briefcase. Marcus slid a tabloid across the desk. The headline made Richard's blood run cold. Billionaire's secret family, Thompson's hidden mistress and children. Below, grainy photos showed Richard entering Sarah's house carrying groceries, helping Emily from his car at the hospital. What the hell is this? Richard demanded. Someone's been following you, Marcus said grimly. The story implies you've had a secret second family for years. Our stock dropped 8 points this morning. The board is concerned about potential scandals. Richard's mind raced. This is absurd. Sarah is... Who is she, Rich? Marcus interrupted. Really? We've been friends for 30 years, and suddenly you're spending all your time with this mystery woman and her kids. She's someone I'm helping, nothing more. Marcus looked skeptical. The board wants you to issue a statement, distance yourself. We're in the middle of the Preston acquisition. We can't afford negative publicity. Richard stared at his friend, suddenly seeing the corporate machine he'd helped build for what it was, an entity that valued perception over people. Profit over compassion. And what if I don't distance myself? Richard asked quietly. Marcus's expression hardened. Don't be stupid, Rich. These people aren't worth your reputation. As if summoned by the conversation, Richard's phone rang. Sarah calling for the first time since their argument. Richard, her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Emily collapsed at school. We're at Northwestern again. The doctors are saying she needs surgery. Her voice broke. I can't do this alone. I'm on my way, Richard said without hesitation. Marcus stared as Richard gathered his coat. You're leaving? Now we have the board meeting in 20 minutes. Richard paused at the door, feeling a strange sense of clarity. Tell the board something's come up. Something important. More important than the company you've spent your life building, Marcus called after him. Richard didn't answer, already. Hurrying toward the elevator, the tabloid left behind on his desk like the discarded skin of a former self. The pediatric cardiac unit was a maze of beeping monitors and hushed voices. Richard found Sarah in the waiting area, her normally straight posture crumpled, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. What happened? Richard asked, sitting beside her. Her medication isn't working anymore. Sarah's voice was mechanical, as if emotional detachment was the only way to deliver the news. The cardiomyopathy is progressing faster than they expected. They're prepping her for surgery now. Richard placed a hand over Sarah's clenched fingers. She's in the best hospital with the best doctors, the Wilsons called. Sarah's laugh was hollow. They offered to pay for the surgery if I sign over temporary custody while she recovers. Richard felt cold fury building. Tell me you didn't... Of course not. Sarah finally met his eyes. But their lawyer pointed out that I'm one paycheck, away from homelessness, living in a house I don't own with a child needing intensive medical care I can't afford. I can handle the medical expenses, Richard said firmly, and give them more ammunition. Sarah pulled her hands away. They're already using my suspicious relationship with you in their filing. The tabloid photos were their doing. They hired someone to follow us. Before Richard could respond, a doctor approached in surgical scrubs. Mrs. Wilson, we're ready to take Emily back now. Sarah stood, visibly gathering her strength. It's Ms. Davis, not Mrs. Wilson, and I want to see her before you start. As Sarah followed the doctor, Ethan emerged from around a corner, his small face tight with controlled fear. She's going to die, isn't she? He asked Richard bluntly. Richard knelt to meet the boy's eyes. No, the doctors are going to fix her heart. That's what they said about Dad too. Ethan's voice was flat. I heard Grandma and Grandpa talking. They said Mom can't take care of us, that Emily got sick because Mom was too busy working to notice. That's not true, Richard said firmly. Then, why are they trying to take us away? Ethan demanded, a crack finally appearing in his carefully maintained composure. Why does everything keep going wrong even when I do everything right? Before Richard could answer, his phone rang. Caroline. The gallery opening. With everything happening, he'd completely forgotten. I have to take this, he told Ethan, stepping away. Caroline? Where are you? His daughter's voice was tight. The exhibition started an hour ago. Caroline, I'm so sorry. I'm at the hospital. The hospital? Are you okay? For the first time in years, genuine concern colored her voice. I'm fine, but a friend's daughter is having emergency heart surgery. A long pause followed. This is about that woman from the tabloids, isn't it? Mom called this morning, gloating about your midlife crisis family making headlines. Richard closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. It's not what it looks like. It never is with you, Dad. The brief warmth in Caroline's voice had vanished. You always had your reasons for missing my recitals, my graduation, my birthdays. Always someone else who needed you more? Caroline, please, forget it. I don't know why I expected anything different. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone, feeling as though he was losing his daughter all over again. When he returned to the waiting area, Ethan was gone. Panic surged through Richard as he searched the floor, finally finding the boy huddled in a small chapel at the end of the corridor. Your phone call was more important, right? Ethan's accusation cut deep. Richard sat beside him on the hard wooden bench. It was my daughter. I was supposed to be at her event tonight. So go, Ethan said, staring straight ahead. That's what adults do. They leave when things get hard. I'm not leaving, Richard said quietly. Ethan's composure finally shattered. Everyone leaves. Dad left. Mom's always working. Now Emily might... His voice broke as sobs overtook him. Richard hesitated, then pulled the boy against his shoulder. feeling thin arms wrapped desperately around his neck as Ethan finally released months of tightly controlled grief. 5 hours later, the surgical team emerged. Emily had survived the procedure, but recovery would be long and difficult. She would need someone with her constantly during the first weeks. "I'll take time off work," Sarah said immediately, though the shadows under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "You can't afford to," Richard said gently. "Not with the custody battle coming." "What choice do I have?" Sarah's voice cracked. "The Wilsons will use any absence against me." A nurse approached with discharge paperwork and a prescription list. Longer than Sarah's arm. The estimated patient responsibility, even after insurance, was more than she would make in 6 months. Sarah stared at the numbers, swaying slightly. "I can't, Sarah," Richard said quietly. "Let me help, not as charity, but as family." Her head snapped up. "We're not your family, Richard. Maybe not by blood," he acknowledged. "But what else would you call this?" Before she could answer, Richard's phone rang again. Marcus calling for the 4th time. Richard silenced it without answering. "Your real life is calling," Sarah said bitterly. "You should answer." "This is my real life," Richard replied. "Not the boardrooms, not the acquisitions. This, being here, helping people I care about, feels more real than anything I've done in decades." In the ICU, Emily lay small and frighteningly still, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that hissed and beeped in mechanical rhythm. Ethan stood at her bedside, whispering his mantra to her sleeping form. "If you do everything right, nothing can go wrong," he repeated. "So you have to do everything right, Em. You have to get better." Outside the room, Richard made a decision. He called Marcus back. "Where the hell have you been?" his partner demanded. "The board is furious. The Preston deal is falling apart." "I'm taking a leave of absence," Richard said simply, effective immediately. "Have you lost your mind over some woman you barely know?" "I know her well enough," Richard replied. "Put Johnson in charge of the Preston acquisition. He's been ready. For more responsibility." "Rich, listen to yourself. You're throwing away everything for what matters," Richard finished. "I already lost my wife and daughter because I put the business first. I won't make that mistake again." After hanging up, Richard found Sarah slumped in a chair outside Emily's room, defeat etched in every line of her body. "The custody hearing is next week," she whispered. "With Emily in this condition, with these bills, I don't stand a chance." Richard sat beside her. "What if I testified on your behalf? My lawyers could—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "The Wilsons' attorney would twist our relationship into something sordid. It would only make things worse." "Then marry me," Richard said quietly. Sarah's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. "What? A marriage of convenience," he clarified quickly. "It would solve the financial concerns, provide stability for the custody case, and—" "No." Sarah's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "I won't be a charity case, and I won't use you that way." "Then what will you do?" Richard asked, genuine fear for this family. Yes, they had become his family, tightening his chest. Sarah looked through the glass at her children, one fighting for her life, the other fighting to hold everything together with sheer force of will. "Whatever I have to," she answered, her voice barely audible. "Whatever I have to." The week before the custody hearing passed in a blur of hospital rooms and legal preparations. Emily's recovery was slower than expected, each day bringing new complications. A post-surgical infection, adverse reactions to medications, the psychological trauma of waking up intubated, surrounded by machines. Richard had taken up residence, in a chair beside her bed, working remotely when necessary, stepping out only for Sarah's hushed consultations with her court-appointed attorney, a well-meaning but overworked public defender who couldn't hide his pessimism about their chances against the Wilsons' high-powered legal team. "They've subpoenaed your financial records," the attorney informed Sarah 3 days before the hearing, "and they're calling the shelter director as a witness regarding your previous living conditions." Sarah's face remained stoic, though her hands trembled as she accepted the documents. "What about character witnesses? I have colleagues who can testify. They've filed a motion to exclude most of your witnesses as recent acquaintances without substantive knowledge of your parenting." The attorney's expression was apologetic. "Mrs. Wilson has submitted dozens of photos and videos of the children from family gatherings before your husband's death." "Gatherings they barely attended," Sarah said bitterly. "They showed up for Christmas and Easter, took photos for their country club friends, then ignored us until the next holiday." The attorney cleared his throat uncomfortably. They've also submitted the tabloid photos of Mr. Thompson, suggesting an unstable living environment and questionable influences. Richard, who had entered mid-conversation, felt a surge of helpless anger. "I'll testify. Explain the situation." "With all due respect, sir," the attorney said, "given the nature of the speculation about your relationship, your testimony might do more harm than good." Outside Emily's room, Ethan sat cross-legged, on the floor methodically folding origami cranes. A nurse had told him about the Japanese tradition, "Fold 1,000 cranes and your wish would come true." He was on number 341. "Is Mom going to lose us?" he asked when Richard joined him, his fingers never pausing in their precise creases. Richard wanted to offer reassurance, but the boy had endured too many broken promises already. "I don't know," he admitted. "The Wilsons have advantages in court that have nothing to do with who would be better parents." Ethan nodded, his expression far too old for his years. "They have money and a big house. Mom just has love, and you have me," Richard said quietly. "Whatever happens, I won't abandon you." Ethan's hands finally stilled. "People always leave, Mr. Thompson, even when they don't want to." His gaze drifted to Emily's room. "Even when they fight really hard to stay." The day of the hearing arrived with cruel brightness, winter sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Emily had been discharged the previous evening, fragile but stable enough to recover at home with visiting nurses. Richard had arranged for a private nurse to stay with her during the hearing. The courtroom felt cavernous, its wooden benches and formal atmosphere designed to intimidate. The Wilsons sat with their attorneys, Edward Wilson in an impeccable suit, his wife Margaret's pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They looked like what they were, wealthy, respectable pillars of society, the perfect grandparents. Sarah had dressed in her best clothes, a modest navy dress slightly faded from repeated washing, and the only pair of heels she owned. Richard sat several rows back at his attorney's insistence, their strategy being to downplay his connection to the family. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, reviewed the documents before addressing the court. "This is a petition for custody modification regarding minors Ethan and Emily Davis. I understand Emily is recovering from heart surgery." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah's attorney confirmed. "She was discharged yesterday with a care plan. A care plan the petitioners are better equipped to implement," the Wilsons' attorney interjected smoothly. "The children's paternal grandparents have the financial resources and stable environment necessary for proper recovery." The proceedings unfolded with brutal efficiency. The Wilsons' attorney presented evidence of Sarah's financial instability, the shelter stay, the multiple school transfers, all framed as evidence of an unstable and potentially harmful environment. Sarah's attorney did his best, emphasizing her dedication as a mother, her consistent employment despite challenges, the children's academic record showing they were thriving despite hardships. But with each exhibit, each witness, the imbalance. Self-power became more evident. When Sarah finally took the stand, her voice was steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "I've made mistakes," she admitted, "but everything I've done has been for my children." "Including establishing a relationship with Mr. Thompson?" the Wilsons' attorney asked, gesturing toward Richard. "A man with resources that could certainly benefit your situation?" Sarah's eyes flashed. "Mr. Thompson is a friend who offered help when no one else would, including my in-laws, who knew we were struggling after James died." Margaret Wilson flinched visibly at the accusation. "And you're living in a property owned by Mr. Thompson, correct? Rent-free?" The attorney's implication was clear. Before Sarah could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. A young woman in an elegant black dress strode down the aisle, her confident steps echoing in the suddenly silent room. "Your Honor," she announced, approaching the bench, "I need to address the court." Judge Harmon frowned. "This is a closed hearing, miss. Unless you're a witness, I am," the woman stated firmly. "Caroline Thompson, and I have evidence relevant to these proceedings." Richard stared in shock as his daughter, who hadn't spoken to him in years, presented herself to the court. Caroline avoided his gaze, speaking directly to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm a child psychologist specializing in trauma and family transitions." She handed documents to the clerk. "Those are my credentials. I'd like to offer expert testimony about the Davis children, whom I've evaluated privately." The Wilsons' attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection! We've had no notice of this witness or any evaluation." "When was this evaluation conducted?" Judge Harmon asked, reviewing Caroline's credentials. "Yesterday evening," Caroline answered, "at the request of Sarah Davis." Richard looked at Sarah, who appeared equally surprised by this development. After reviewing Caroline's paperwork, Judge Harmon nodded. "I'll allow limited testimony. Under oath, Caroline spoke with professional authority. I conducted standard assessments of both children. They show strong attachment to their mother, age-appropriate development despite their challenges, and concerning levels of anxiety about separation from Ms. Davis." "And what's your professional opinion regarding a custody change?" Sarah's attorney asked. "It would be psychologically damaging," Caroline stated firmly. "Ethan, in particular, shows signs of trauma related to his father's death. Separating him from his mother would likely exacerbate his issues with abandonment and control." The Wilsons' attorney approached for cross-examination. "Dr. Thompson, given your father's relationship with Ms. Davis, couldn't your testimony be considered biased?" Caroline fixed him with a cool stare. "My father and I have been estranged for 3 years, as my sworn affidavit indicates. I have no personal relationship with Ms. Davis. My assessment is based solely on clinical observation." When court recessed for the judge's deliberation, Richard approached Caroline in the hallway. "Why?" he asked simply. Caroline's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Your messages about Emily's surgery, about how much those kids have been through." She straightened her jacket. "I may be angry with you, Dad, but I'm still a professional. Those children shouldn't suffer because their mother can't afford better lawyers." "Thank you," Richard said, emotion thickening his voice. Caroline's expression remained distant. "Don't thank me yet. The Wilsons have a strong case." An hour later, they reassembled in the courtroom. Judge Harmon looked grave as she delivered her ruling. "After reviewing all evidence, I find that while Ms. Davis has faced significant challenges, she has consistently prioritized her children's welfare. However," she continued, causing Sarah to tense, "the financial instability and Emily's medical needs present legitimate concerns." Richard held his breath, seeing the devastation already beginning to form on Sarah's face. "Therefore," Judge Harmon concluded, "I'm ordering a 6-month conditional arrangement. The children will remain with their mother with weekly visitation for the grandparents. The court will reassess in 6 months, contingent upon Ms. Davis maintaining stable housing and Emily receiving proper medical care." Sarah's sob of relief echoed in the suddenly quiet courtroom. The Wilsons conferred with their attorney, clearly displeased but not defeated. "You haven't won," Margaret Wilson hissed as she passed Sarah. "In 6 months, when you can't maintain that house or pay for Emily's treatments, we'll be back." Outside the courthouse, snowflakes drifted lazily from a steel-gray sky. Ethan waited on the steps, another crane taking shape in his small hands. When he saw his mother emerge, he stood uncertainly. "We get to stay together," Sarah told him, kneeling to embrace him despite her exhaustion. For now, at least. Caroline approached them, her professional detachment softening as she watched the reunion. "He's making a senbazuru," she observed, nodding toward Ethan's crane. 1,000 cranes for a wish. "It's the only thing I could think to do," Ethan admitted. Caroline knelt beside him. "It's a good strategy, doing something concrete while waiting for things beyond your control." Ethan studied her curiously. "Are you really Mr. Thompson's daughter?" "I am," Caroline confirmed. "He misses you," Ethan said simply. "He looks at your picture the same way Mum looks at Dad's." Caroline's composure wavered momentarily. She glanced at Richard, who stood apart from the group, unsure of his place. 6 months isn't long, Caroline said finally, addressing Sarah. "You'll need a more permanent solution before the review." "I know," Sarah acknowledged, the brief joy of their victory already fading beneath the weight of reality. 6 months. To somehow become financially stable, maintain Emily's care and fend off the Wilsons permanently. As if reading her thoughts, Richard stepped forward. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Together." The word hung in the winter air between them, its meaning both a commitment and a question. February in Chicago brought bitter winds and unforgiving ice. 1 month after the hearing, Emily's recovery continued slowly, each small improvement shadowed by the ticking clock of the court's 6-month deadline. Sarah had pinned a calendar to the kitchen wall, each passing day marked with a red X that seemed to whisper, "Time is running out." Richard had returned to work part-time, restructuring his role to allow more flexibility. The tabloid stories had faded, replaced by newer scandals, though the damage to his corporate reputation lingered. Several board members had voiced concerns about his questionable priorities. Richard found to his own surprise that he cared less than he would have expected. Caroline had maintained cautious contact, calling weekly to check on Emily's progress. Her professional interest had gradually softened into something more personal, not quite warmth, but no longer the icy detachment of past years. She was civil to Richard during their brief interactions, a fragile bridge forming over the chasm of their estrangement. One evening, as Sarah helped Emily with breathing exercises prescribed by her cardiac rehabilitation team, Richard sat at the kitchen table reviewing financial options. The numbers were daunting. Even with his assistance, Sarah's income couldn't match the stability the court demanded, not while maintaining Emily's care and the mounting legal fees for the inevitable next round with the Wilsons. "You look worried," Sarah observed entering the kitchen after settling Emily for the night. Richard closed his laptop, just considering possibilities. Sarah poured herself tea, the simple domestic gesture now familiar in its routine. "The Wilsons called again today. They want to take the kids to Florida over spring break. What did you tell them?" "That Emily isn't cleared for travel." Sarah's hands tightened around the mug. "Margaret said they'd have their doctor submit an opinion to the court that the trip would be therapeutic." Richard felt the now familiar surge of protectiveness. "They won't stop." "No," Sarah agreed, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "They want my children, and they have the resources to keep fighting until I break." From the hallway came the soft sound of paper folding, Ethan continuing his 1,000 cranes. He was approaching 600 now, each one meticulously creased, a physical manifestation of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. "He overheard me talking to the hospital billing department today," Sarah said quietly. "Now he's insisting on applying for that gifted student scholarship at Westridge Academy. Says if he gets in, his education won't be another burden on me." Richard felt a familiar ache at the boy's premature sense of responsibility. "He's carrying too much." "We all are," Sarah replied, then hesitated before continuing. "Your daughter called me directly today. She wants to meet, just the two of us." Richard tried to mask his surprise. "Did she say why?" "Professional concern about Ethan and Emily officially, but I think there's more to it." Sarah studied Richard's expression. "She has your eyes, you know, and that same look when something matters, like you're memorizing every detail." The observation caught Richard off guard. How well this woman had come to know him in such a short time, noticing things about him that business associates of 20 years never had. "I should get some sleep," Sarah said, rising. "Emily's night nurse is coming at 11. As she passed, Richard caught her hand. "Sarah, wait." The contact was brief but electric, a current of unacknowledged feeling passing between them. "Whatever. Caroline says, remember she has complicated feelings about me, about fathers in general." Sarah nodded, gently withdrawing her hand. "Good night, Richard." The following afternoon, Caroline and Sarah met at a quiet cafe near Northwestern Hospital, where Emily had a follow-up appointment. Richard waited with the children in the pediatric wing, teaching Ethan chess to pass the time, while a nurse checked Emily's vitals. "My dad taught me when I was about your age," Richard explained, setting up the board. "Was he a good dad?" Ethan asked, studying the pieces. The question landed like a punch to the gut. "He tried to be," Richard answered carefully. "He worked a lot. I didn't understand then how complicated adults' lives can be." "My dad worked a lot too," Ethan said, moving a pawn. "But he always read me a story at night, even when he was really tired." His small fingers hovered over the board. "Do you think he'd be mad that I like when you teach me stuff?" Richard swallowed hard. "No, I think he'd be grateful someone was there when he couldn't be." Across town, Caroline watched Sarah stir her coffee, clinically noting the signs of chronic stress. The slight tremor in her hands, the darkened skin beneath her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "I've been reviewing Emily's latest assessments," Caroline began, her professional tone belying the personal nature of the meeting. "Her resilience is remarkable, but she's showing signs of anxiety about the custody situation." Sarah nodded. "She has nightmares about being taken away. And Ethan's controlling behaviors have intensified," Caroline continued. "The Crane Project, his obsessive organization, the mantra about doing things right, their coping mechanisms." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But what can I do? Tell them everything will be fine when we all know the Wilsons might win in June." Caroline hesitated, then abandoned her professional detachment. "What exactly is your relationship with my father?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. "He's a friend who's helped us when no one else would." Sarah answered carefully. My father doesn't have friends, Caroline replied, a lifetime of hurt evident in her tone. He has business associates, employees, and investments. Maybe he's changing, Sarah suggested. Caroline's laugh held little humor. At 57, people don't change, Ms. Davis. They reveal who they've always been. And who do you think your father really is? Caroline stared into her untouched tea. A man who missed my high school graduation because a Tokyo deal couldn't... Wait, who sent his assistant to my college parents' weekend? Who called my engagement impulsive because he'd never bothered to meet the man I'd been dating for 3 years? Sarah absorbed this, understanding better now the pain behind Caroline's cool exterior. The man you're describing isn't the Richard. I know. Then you don't know him, Caroline said flatly. Or maybe you both need to know each other again, Sarah suggested gently. People can change when something forces them to see themselves clearly. Caroline's professional mask slipped completely. Like my mother leaving? Like my cutting him out of my life? Those didn't change him. Maybe he wasn't ready then, Sarah said. Sometimes it takes losing almost everything to recognize what matters. Back at the hospital, Emily's appointment had concluded with mixed news. Her heart function was improving, but slower than hoped. The doctor recommended additional medications, more frequent monitoring, and possibly another procedure if certain measurements didn't improve by April. More expenses, Sarah whispered to Richard in the corridor, out of the children's earshot. More ammunition for the Wilsons to claim I can't provide adequate care. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Board meeting emergency vote. Tomorrow. Your leadership position under review. Call me ASAP. Richard stared at the message, the corporate crisis that would have consumed him months ago, now seeming distant and unimportant compared to the family crisis unfolding before him. Bad news? Sarah asked, noticing his expression. Nothing that matters, Richard replied, pocketing the phone without responding. That night, after the children were asleep, Richard found Sarah on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, despite the cold, staring at the star-scattered sky. My meeting with Caroline was illuminating, she said as he joined her. She told you what a terrible father I was, Richard guessed. She told me who you were, Sarah corrected, not who you are now. Richard absorbed this. And who am I now? Sarah? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. Someone caught between worlds, between who you were and who you're becoming. And if I know which world I want to choose? Richard asked quietly. Sarah's reply was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and a small cry from inside the house. They rushed in to find Emily on the kitchen floor, a shattered water glass beside her, her face alarmingly pale. Can't breathe, she gasped, clutching her chest. The next hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens, emergency room chaos, and tense consultations with cardiac specialists. Dawn was breaking when the diagnosis came. A blood clot had formed, a potentially fatal complication of Emily's condition and surgery. As Emily was rushed to emergency surgery, Richard held Sarah while she finally broke, sobbing against his chest. I can't lose her, she cried. I can't. Ethan sat nearby, methodically folding another crane, his small hands steady, even as tears slid silently down his face. Through his grief, one thought crystallized in Richard's mind with absolute clarity. These people were his family now, not by blood or law, but by something deeper, by choice, by love, by the recognition of souls meant to heal each other. Whatever it cost him, his company, his fortune, his past identity, he would protect them. The surgical waiting room had become a familiar purgatory, a liminal space where time stretched and contracted unpredictably. Richard sat beside Sarah, her hand cold in his, while Ethan methodically folded crane number 678, his small fingers never faltering despite having been awake for nearly 24 hours. Family of Emily Davis. A surgeon appeared, still in scrubs, his mask pulled down to reveal an exhausted face. Sarah stood so quickly she nearly fell, Richard steadying her by the elbow. Yes, I'm her mother. We've removed the clot and stabilized her cardiac function, the doctor explained. But I need to be direct. This complication is concerning. Emily's heart suffered additional damage. She needs to be on the transplant list. The word transplant hit like a physical blow. Sarah swayed, and Richard guided her back to the chair. Her heart transplant, she whispered, but she's only 8. Children can do very well with transplants, the surgeon assured her, but the waiting period can be lengthy, and she'll need comprehensive care while we wait. Specialized medications. weekly monitoring, possibly inpatient periods. Sarah's face had gone completely white. The cost? The surgeon's expression was sympathetic but realistic. It's substantial. Your insurance will cover some, but there will be significant out-of-pocket expenses. Our financial counselor can discuss options. As the surgeon left, Ethan abandoned his crane, crawling into his mother's lap despite being too old for such gestures. "Is Emily going to die?" he asked bluntly. "No," Richard answered before Sarah could, his voice firm with a conviction he wouldn't allow himself to doubt. "We're going to get her the care she needs." Sarah looked up at him, gratitude and fear warring in her expression. The "we" hadn't gone unnoticed. Later that night, while Sarah slept fitfully in Emily's ICU room, Richard made 2 calls that would irrevocably change the course of all their lives. The first was to his attorney. "I want to liquidate my holdings in Thompson Enterprises. All of them." "Richard, that's over 60% of your net worth," his attorney protested. "At least keep your voting shares." "All of it," Richard repeated. "And I want to establish a medical trust for Emily Davis, the girl I told you about. It needs to be fully funded by the end of the week." The second call was to Caroline. To his surprise, she answered on the first ring. "Dad, is Emily—" "She survived the surgery," Richard said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But she needs a heart transplant." The silence on the line stretched. Then, "What do you need from me?" The simple question, absent of judgment or hesitation, broke something open in Richard's chest. "She's going to need psychological support through this. Sarah is barely holding on. Ethan is trying to be strong for everyone." "And you?" Caroline asked quietly. "I'm doing what I should have done for you and your mother," Richard answered. "Being present, putting family first." Another pause. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." 3 days later, Emily was stable enough to be moved from ICU to a regular cardiac unit. The hospital room now displayed dozens of Ethan's cranes, suspended from the ceiling on threads, dancing in the currents from the heating vents. Each morning he carefully hung new ones above his sister's bed, counting them aloud, as if the milestone of 1,000 might arrive simultaneously with a miraculous recovery. Richard had taken up permanent residence in a corner chair, fielding constant calls from Marcus and the board, as news of his stock liquidation sent ripples through the financial world. Thompson Enterprises shares had plummeted with the announcement that its founder was divesting completely. "The board is calling for your resignation," Marcus informed him, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. 30 years of building this company and you're tanking it for what? This random family." "They're not random to me," Richard replied simply. "You've lost your mind," Marcus snapped. "Caroline agrees with me. She called me yesterday, worried about your mental state." Richard glanced up to see Caroline herself entering the room, carrying coffee and a bag of fresh clothes for Sarah. "Did she? Interesting. She's standing right here helping Emily's family. Goodbye, Marcus." Caroline raised an eyebrow as he ended the call. "Marcus is playing both sides," she observed, handing him coffee. "He called me claiming you were having a breakdown, hoping I'd help convince you to return to the company. And you're not concerned about my mental health?" Richard asked, only half joking. Caroline considered this as she arranged the clothes she'd brought for Sarah. "I think you're more sane now than you've been in decades," she finally said. "It's just not a version of sanity the Marcus Johnsons of the world recognize." In the bed, Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Though heavily medicated, she managed a weak smile. "Did Ethan finish his cranes yet?" she asked, her voice barely audible. 712, Richard told her, moving to her bedside. "He's getting closer every day." Emily's small hand reached for his. "Mum said cranes are for wishes. What's your wish, Mr. Thompson?" The simple question caught him off guard. What did he wish for? Not his company back, not his former life of isolated wealth. "For all of us to be together," he answered honestly, "safe and well." Emily nodded as if this made perfect sense, then drifted back to sleep, the medications pulling her under again. Caroline watched this interaction with the careful eye of both a professional and a daughter, seeing her father in an entirely new light. Sarah returned from her meeting with the hospital's financial counselor, her expression shell-shocked. Even with insurance and financial aid, the medications alone will be thousands per month. If she gets the transplant, the surgery, and aftercare. Her voice trailed off, the numbers too overwhelming to verbalize. "It's handled," Richard said quietly. Sarah looked up sharply. "What do you mean, handled?" "I've established a trust for Emily's medical expenses. Whatever she needs, however long it takes, it's covered." Sarah stared at him, comprehension dawning. Your company. The news reports about you selling your shares. That was for Emily. For all of you, Richard corrected gently. Sarah shook her head, backing away. No, that's too much. We can't accept... Mom? Ethan appeared in the doorway, arms full of paper for more cranes. Grandma and Grandpa Wilson are here. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Edward and Margaret Wilson entered, impeccably dressed and radiating calculated concern. Sarah, Margaret nodded coolly before focusing entirely on Emily. Oh, our poor angel. Edward remained by the door, eyeing Richard and Caroline with undisguised suspicion. We've spoken with our attorney. Given Emily's condition, we believe the custody arrangement should be revisited immediately. Edward, Sarah began, her voice strained with the effort of civility. Now is not the time. On the contrary, he interrupted. Our granddaughter needs the best possible care. Lake Forest has excellent medical facilities and we have a bedroom already prepared. The travel and stress of commuting between the hospital and your housing situation can't be good for her recovery. Caroline stepped forward, professional authority evident in her posture. As Emily's treating psychologist, I strongly advise against any disruption to her family structure during this critical period. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And you are? Dr. Caroline Thompson, she replied evenly. I've been working with Emily and Ethan throughout this crisis. Another Thompson, Margaret observed acidly, glancing between Caroline and Richard. How convenient. Richard had remained silent, watching the color drain from Sarah's face as she once again faced the prospect of losing her children to these cold, calculating people who saw them as possessions to be acquired rather than souls to be nurtured. Something in him snapped, not with anger, but with absolute clarity. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, he said quietly, I understand you want what's best for your grandchildren, but separating them from their mother isn't it. With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, Edward replied coldly, this is a family matter. It is, Richard agreed, which is why I've asked Sarah to marry me. The room went absolutely still. Sarah stared at him, shock evident in her expression. Caroline's eyebrows shot up. We're getting married next week, Richard continued, holding Sarah's gaze, silently pleading with her to understand. Emily will have my insurance coverage, access to the best medical care, and the stability the court requires. This is absurd, Margaret sputtered. A transparent attempt to circumvent the court's authority. Actually, Caroline interjected smoothly, research consistently shows that maintaining primary caregiving relationships is paramount for children experiencing medical trauma. The court would likely view any arrangement that preserves this relationship, while addressing financial concerns as being in the children's best interest. Edward's face had reddened dangerously. This won't stand. Our attorneys will... Your attorneys will what? Richard asked mildly. Argue that two children should be removed from their loving mother and given to grandparents they barely know simply because of money. Money that's no longer an issue. He stepped closer to Sarah, taking her trembling hand. The choice is Sarah's, of course, but if she'll have me, your grandchildren will want for nothing, including their mother's presence. The Wilsons departed, in barely restrained fury, promises of legal action hanging in the air behind them. As the door closed, Sarah turned to Richard, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Which part? Richard asked. The trust, the proposal? I meant them both. Richard, Sarah began, her voice catching. I know it's not romantic, he acknowledged, and it's not how either of us imagined marriage. But Sarah, these past months with you and the children, I've never been more certain of anything. Before she could respond, Emily's monitors began to alarm. Her heart rhythm had become dangerously irregular, her oxygen levels plummeting. She's crashing, a nurse shouted, hitting the emergency button as the room suddenly filled with medical personnel. Sarah was pushed aside as the resuscitation team worked, her anguished cry cutting through the controlled chaos of medical commands. Richard caught her as her knees buckled, holding her upright as they watched the desperate battle for Emily's life unfold before them. Time fragmented as Emily's heart failed. Seconds stretched into eternities as medical staff performed CPR, administered medications, and finally used defibrillator paddles on her tiny chest. Sarah's anguished cries echoed through the cardiac unit, while Richard held her upright, his own heart hammering painfully against his ribs. Please, Sarah sobbed. Please save her. After what felt like hours but was merely minutes, The chaos settled into grim efficiency. Emily was stabilized, but the doctor's expression remained grave. "Her heart is failing faster than we anticipated," he explained quietly. "We're moving her to the top of the regional transplant list, but we need to place her on mechanical support immediately. Do whatever it takes," Richard said firmly. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of surgical procedures as Emily was connected to a ventricular assist device, a mechanical pump to do the work her failing heart could no longer manage. The machinery surrounding her small body made her appear even more fragile, tubes and wires extending from beneath the thin hospital blanket, like some grotesque puppet strings. Ethan had stopped making cranes, instead sitting silently beside his sister's bed, holding her hand when allowed, his young face set in a mask of determined stoicism. It was on the fourth night after Emily's crash that Sarah finally addressed Richard's impulsive proposal. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly as they stood in the dim hallway outside Emily's room. "About marrying me?" Richard met her gaze steadily. "Yes. Why? And don't say it's just for Emily's medical coverage." "Because I love you," Richard answered simply. "All of you. I love Ethan's determination. I love Emily's courage. And I love your fierce heart, Sarah. I love how you've fought for your children against impossible odds. I love who I am when I'm with you. Not a billionaire, not a CEO, just a man trying to do right by the people he cares about." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I can't let you sacrifice everything." "I'm not sacrificing," Richard interrupted gently. "I'm choosing. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what truly matters." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The transplant coordinator. "They have a heart," she whispered, gripping Richard's arm. "They have a heart for Emily." The surgery lasted 14 hours. Richard, Sarah, Ethan, and Caroline kept vigil in the waiting room, each lost in their own thoughts and prayers. When the surgeon finally appeared, his face showed the exhaustion of his marathon effort, but his eyes held cautious hope. "The new heart is beating on its own," he announced. "The next 48 hours are critical for rejection risks, but the initial signs are very positive." Sarah collapsed against Richard, relief temporarily overwhelming her. Caroline squeezed Ethan's shoulder as the boy finally allowed himself to cry. 2 months later, on a surprisingly warm May afternoon, a small gathering assembled in the garden of Richard's lake house. Emily, still thin but with color, returning to her cheeks, sat in a decorated wheelchair, a basket of flower petals in her lap. Ethan stood beside her in a new suit, his face solemn with the responsibility of ring-bearer. Caroline adjusted Sarah's simple white dress, a peace offering between two women who had found unexpected common ground in their love for the same family. "Ready?" Caroline asked. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on Richard waiting beneath an arbor of spring flowers. "Ready." As Emily scattered petals from her wheelchair and Ethan carried the rings with careful precision, Sarah walked toward her future. Not the future she had planned, but one unexpectedly filled with both challenges and profound love. Timon Wilson's had not attended, though the custody case had been withdrawn after Emily's transplant, and Richard's marriage to Sarah made their financial arguments moot. Some wounds would take more time to heal, but as Richard and Sarah exchanged vows, the assembled guests witnessed something rare and precious, a family formed not by obligation or blood, but by choice and love. 6 months later, Richard drove home from a meeting with investors in his new charitable foundation dedicated to supporting families facing catastrophic medical costs. As he pulled into the driveway of their Oak Park home, he smiled at the sight of Ethan teaching Emily chess on the front porch, her recovery progressing better than anyone had dared hope. Inside, he found Sarah reviewing applications for medical billing positions at the hospital, where she now worked as a department supervisor. She looked up as he entered, her smile warming him more thoroughly than any business success ever had. "Welcome home," she said simply. The phrase still caught him by surprise sometimes, not just the words, but the profound truth behind them. This was home. These people were home. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Emily asked Ethan what he'd wished for when he'd finally completed his 1,000 cranes the day before her transplant. "I can't tell," Ethan replied seriously. "Or it won't come true." "But it already did come true," Emily insisted. "I got my new heart." Ethan glanced at Richard and Sarah, then back to his sister. "That wasn't my wish." "Then what was it?" Emily persisted. Ethan finally smiled, the rare expression transforming his solemn face. I wished for us to be a real family, all of us. Richard reached for Sarah's hand under the table, feeling the simple gold band on her finger that symbolized not just their marriage, but the truth he'd learned on a snowy Chicago street corner. Sometimes the most valuable things in life were found in the most unexpected places. Life can change in an instant. One moment, Richard Thompson was a wealthy but empty man, and the next, a chance encounter with a struggling family on a cold Chicago street transformed him forever.